Been here a couple of times in Wolfville. My first time at the seminary. It was great to be with you at dinner tonight. And just to hear the reports and feel the vitality and the interest. Sunday morning at the church, I was talking about the critical opportunities we have in our nation today. And for me to be a part of a group of colleagues across the country that are engaged in preparing people for Christian leadership at the congregational and missional level. And to see the energy and the focus and the professionalism and the commitment and the passion in the raising up of a new generation of leadership. So I'm greatly encouraged to have built this friendship with Lee over the last few years. As presidents across the country, we have opportunity to do that. But to find a soulmate, somebody who has, and we're of the vintage year, we're both of 1942, and folks, that was a great year. A little humor, folks, just a little humor. Actually, there weren't many born in 42 because there weren't many fathers around, but you and I happened to benefit. So to have the friendship and to have this vision that catches fire across the land, it's so encouraging to me. And to be here today, I'm delighted. When you were reading out, Carol Ann, the various people who were part of this distance experience tonight, you read out the name of Littleton Pentecostal Church somewhere out in the Miramichi area. Pardon? Blue Road? Boone Road. Well, Littleton is what I heard. And I remember preaching in that church in 1966. So that's a little bit of history. Welcome to the event tonight. Last night I began with the subject on vision. My simple thesis is that in leadership, whether it's for the 21st century or the 17th century, vision is an inescapable part of what we do. 2 years ago, I had opportunity of speaking to a number of pastors in Indonesia, in Yogyakarta, at the Indonesian Evangelical Seminary. Dr. Chris Marantika is president. He was, as an Indonesian, interesting story, he arrived in the U.S. in the 70s. And in a remarkable way, was able to complete his doctorate. And as he was going back to Indonesia, he asked, Lord, what can we do to touch this country for Christ? And he believed the best thing he could do was to establish a seminary. And so he just started the seminary. But his vision was planting churches. And he believed that in training pastors to go out and plant churches, it would be the way to evangelize Indonesia. And so he had a very interesting component to the graduating part of the exercise. It was this: every student before they graduated had to plant a church of no less than 30 adults that came in by conversion and not by transfer. His vision was this. He would say 1 + 1 + 1. And if Chris said that once a day when I was there, I heard him say it 10 times a day. It was this: one church for every community in one generation. And he has taken a community and moved them to this common vision. And out of that vision, there is evangelization going on in Indonesia, which is remarkable in form to any other nation of the world. Vision is indispensable to us in our leadership. Last night we looked at Nehemiah. Now, while Nehemiah built a broken wall, his vision wasn't to build a broken wall. His vision was to protect the holy city of God, city of David. The temple had been rebuilt. But the temple was open to enormous abuse without a wall. And so the building of the wall was simply a part of that larger vision that not only coalesced the resources, but brought to rescue the city of God. Tonight, I'd like to take you to a different area of the Scriptures, to the New Testament, and look at the early church and see how vision was absolutely essential to the transforming of people's lives, who in turn brought transformation to this young and early church. It was a little church. Well, it wasn't a church. It wasn't known as that yet. But there was a group of people in Damascus, in Syria, They had followed the teachings of this rabbi from Nazareth. And then when they heard that he had died, word eventually filtered back to them that he had come back to life. And that only intensified their interest. One day there was a conversation. The conversation went something like this. You may want to do a cross-reference in Acts 9. Ananias, yes? I have a little thing I'd like you to do. What's that, Lord? You've heard about Saul. Well, right now, and this may surprise you, for as we speak, he's praying. And while I'm speaking to you, I'm also speaking to him. And here's what I'm saying. I'm saying, Saul, in a few moments, a man by the name of Ananias is going to come and he's going to lay his hands on you and you're going to be healed. And then he's going to show you what you're to do. You've got to be kidding, Lord. Do you have any... Well, yes, I know you have all the ideas. You know what he's about. But he is a mean-spirited person from Jerusalem. He's part of the power base of the Sanhedrin. You know what he has done to others, and you know what he could do to us here. And I'm responsible for this little group, this study group up here in Damascus. And Ananias, do it. And he did. Now, if it were you or me in that moment, I expect we would have responded to that call the same way he did, by fear. Fear is a natural human response. We respond to fear in a variety of ways. We can either protect ourselves or we lash out. One of our favorite holidays was to go to Banff. Out of Saskatoon, we'd drive across the western prairies, up through Calgary and up into Banff. It was one of those August afternoons. We arrived at Lake Louise. And we went off to see the lake as Mom was preparing the lunch, as moms did back in those days. And only our mom could prepare a picnic that could satisfy the hunger of a young boy. We wandered off to the lake. Dad was with us. And as we came back, we heard a noise. And as we rounded the corner, there on the lawn, on the picnic table, was Mom with her purse fighting off a black bear. Now, you and I know that's the last thing you should do. The rangers warn you never to attack a bear. The problem is they had never met my mother. Fear. Fear is an understandable human response. Many of us dislike confrontation. We back away. We give in. But fear, as much as it's understandable and part of the human experience, it still is not listed in the list of the fruits of the Spirit. While you and I know fear will come as we lead, if fear becomes a ruling denominator within the equation of our lives, we know that inevitably, whatever level of leadership we operate at, we will fail. Fear comes our way. How do we deal with fear? Ananias, we can feel the impulse of fear. If we just put ourselves into his moment, into his situation, we feel that same ripple of fear in the gut. Go to Saul, the one that's going to attack this little group that have trusted their lives to me. In that moment, there was a vision. And the vision was transforming. It was a conscious choice that Ananias had to make. It wasn't simply existential. It wasn't simply that which he naturally did because the Lord called. He had to make a choice. And so when he was called, Ananias, do it, and he said, yes, Lord, it was a response to a call, but it was a conscious response to a thoughtful call. It didn't just happen. What was the movement? What was the transformation? What did he experience in moving from fear? And that movement made all the difference. Think of the consequences if Ananias had not responded. and we had not had Paul to fertilize our minds and articulate the faith and to lead us in doctrine, what was the movement? He moved from that paradigm or that window or that human response of fear to one of faith. It wasn't that he was filled with faith. It's just that he responded in obedience, and that itself was an act of faith. We learn right from the beginning of our journey that without faith it's impossible to please God. Now, if me, out of the Pentecostal holiness tradition, I would say without holiness it's impossible to please God. And though you Baptists would say without right doctrine it's impossible to please God. And you Reformed people would say without believing that Calvin is next to Paul it's impossible to please God. Or whatever we would go on to say. It doesn't say that. The writer to the Hebrews in chapter 11 doesn't say something else. It says without faith, because at the very beginning of everything we do and believe is that act of faith. And fear, I think one could even call sin, because it's the antithesis of what is required for us to please God. Now, we have many fault lines. We have many default zones in our lives. I have predilections to a variety of things, and so do you. For some of us, that might match if we were honest enough in our confession with each other. But I suspect we'll keep it well off the agenda. But we have those default zones, and we know what they are. I could list mine, you could list yours. But how often in the journey of leadership do we identify the lack of fear as a default zone that is inhibiting to us in our leadership role? Faith is like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it will get. Or like the lawyers say, you use it or lose it. The development of faith comes by incremental moments, experiences. I'm an old football player. Love football. I was a fullback back in the old, those of you that remember the split T formation. I love football. But I found with Mike Marischak, my coach, is that he forced me to the rudimentary activities of running in that position. And the more I could do what he told me to do, the more he trusted me with doing more, until finally I moved from third to second to first string. And so it is in our walk of faith as leaders. It's essential for us to find our lives moved out of that zone of fear into the zone of faith. First of all, we fear failure because we know our reputation's on the line. Reputation is the currency of leadership. It is the currency by which we operate. You and I know that the trust that people have in us is the only currency that we have to work with. We were talking earlier, Andrew and I, about moral problems in leadership. And he was saying each year you have one or two or three that have to be taken off the roll because of their moral failure. And yet you and I know that Jesus said if you think in lust, it's like you've committed adultery. So we know behaviorally before God, we are all condemned. But for those of our colleagues who fall in this sense into adulterous sin, because of the nature of that within the face of the community, currency is lost in that one moment. I'm working with two pastors, one from the BCOQ, one from the Pentecostal church, who had large influential churches in Toronto, enormously effective in their ministry. And that one moment it became public, they lost the currency, because trust is essential to leadership. We understand that. The difficulty then is that when we want to exercise any activity that requires faith, the possibility of losing puts at jeopardy the trust that people have in us. So fear of failure is essential. When we move forward in any risk-taking venture. No matter its dimension, whether it's a relational, whether it's a building program, whether it's an initiative in the community, whatever it is, we understand that we are putting ourselves at risk. But there's no other way. If you and I in leadership don't find even those small moments to risk, we never engage God in the process of ministry. And we also know that fear of change can be downright anesthetizing. The fear of change. Well, I find at 63 years of age, there are things that I'm fearful about. But you know what? The older I get, there's some things I just couldn't give a hang about. And I'm prepared to say and do things that I would never do before, because at my age, people say, well, that's just that old stiller. But I don't have to prove myself anymore. I'm not 40 years of age. I'm not carving out for myself a place in ministry. It's already happened. But the fear of change, as you and I know within congregational life, is at the very heart of that which creates difficulty. Ananias moved from fear to faith. And let me suggest that you and I in our ministry need to find ways in which the Spirit moves us out of those moments of traumatizing, neutralizing fear. And we begin to test that muscle of faith. It was 10 years ago this June, as I told you last night. I got a call from Dave Collins, who was vice chair of the board of then OBCOTS. I knew it was in trouble. It was in enormous debt. It was going, as it was slipping into bankruptcy. One of the board members was wise enough to invoke what's called the Trusteeship Act in Canada, which is like the American Chapter 11. It gives you some time to work with your creditors to see if they'll allow you to go on. And so when I was invited to help, in my attempt to figure out whether this is what the Lord really wanted me to do, because I was full-time at EFC and I had no interest in this role, I invited 3 people out for dinner on the Tuesday night. The Monday night is when I was called. I eventually told them on Tuesday, I'll let you know Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. So I called 3 people for dinner from the school, the dean of students, the dean of the seminary, and the dean of the college. We sat down for dinner. I said, don't tell me the problems. Tell me what your vision is. And so over 2.5-hour dinner, they talked to me about what they saw the school's potential. Finally, at the end, Lynn Smith. Many of you knew Roger and Lynn Smith. Lynn Smith said, Brian, this morning, Roger and I in our devotions, we're reading Joshua 3. Let me just remind you of Joshua 3. Moses has died. This young Joshua is now leader. They're still over in the east side of the Jordan. The people of God are saying, how in the world can we get across? And of course, as they look at Jordan, Jordan is at the swollen time of the year. Joshua goes to Yahweh. What do we do, Lord? And the word of the Lord is, when the feet of the priests touch the water, then I will stop the water. Now understand the very heart of that act of faith. Faith is not hope. Faith is not belief. Faith is that activity that puts ourselves in a position that without the enablement of God we'll fail. I love the idea of Oswald J. Smith in his faith promise plan. I put this on film a few years ago, and I got to understand it, and I found the genius of the plan, which is simply this. His challenge to his congregants was, at their missionary conference, was, all right, you've already figured out what your tithe is, what you should be giving. Your faith promise plan is, how much more by faith will you promise the Lord that with His enablement you'll give? And that act of faith would be fulfilled by a windfall. A great aunt dies and leaves you $1 million. We've all fantasized about that one, haven't we? Or you're able to save in ways that you hadn't predicted, so you have that little extra nest egg to give. Or God gives you an extra job. You find a way, but that extra amount is only given because God engages in your life and helps you in that faith promise. And I thought how essential that is to this whole understanding of walking by faith. Only as the feet of the priest touched the water would the Lord stop the water. All the hope and faith and belief that they had access to the promised land meant absolutely nothing until they exercised themselves by faith. And can you imagine those priests walking in the water and drowning? Every possibility. They were crazy, some would say. They didn't hear from the Lord. It was the onions they had the night before. Or a variety. Faith is that activity that without the provision of God will fail. Lynn Smith turned to me after she had reminded me of the story, and she said, "Brian, would you be the priest for us and walk into the water?" Well, you know, as a Pentecostal boy from Saskatchewan, that stuff is hard to resist. And that was the call from the Lord to me. I knew that someone had to exercise faith on behalf of this institution. Now, it was an enormously growing experience for me. As it is for you and I in leadership in the church, we exercise faith in a particular area, and it not only causes us to grow, causes the muscle of faith to expand, but it also leads people into an experience where they begin to see the hand of the Lord. Ananias was transformed from fear to faith. Notice what he did. He went to the house. So he walked the road of faith. He put himself in action. He wasn't exercising faith yet, but he was putting himself in the situation where he would experience faith. He walked the road to faith. Secondly, he went into the house where Paul was staying. He put himself in the context of where faith would come into action. He placed his hands on Paul. And he believed that obedience to God would trigger the response of God into the life of Paul. And then he spoke the words the Lord had instructed him to. And he saw the Spirit bring about transformation, and Paul was set free to begin his journey of faith. So in this first snapshot in Acts, we see how that vision was transforming from fear to faith. But if you have your texts open, look to the next chapter 10. Now remember, this is not a church yet. They're meeting in a synagogue. They aren't engaged in the kind of church activity that we would think of as church. As well, they are very much located in one ethnic grouping. They're trapped. And this next story is of course, as preachers, you know that this is a layered story. And you could spend a few weeks in this story, chapter 10. You got a bit of a sermon from chapter 9, but boy, there's multiple sermons in chapter 10. Let's take a look at chapter 10. Here we've got this character, Peter. He was a conundrum. He was a man of impetuous action, yet often neutralized by fear. He had bold insights, but he was overshadowed by self-centered requests. He had a passionate love for Jesus, which was pushed aside in moments of threat. He was a person of vision, but he was horribly blinded by prejudice. But it was this person the Lord used to move the church in a major way outside of its tight, closed ethnicity. Now, here was the problem. You know the story of chapter 10. Maybe I should just do a quick review of that for you. In Caesarea, you have a Roman soldier by the name of Cornelius who has a heart for God. In his prayers, he hears the voice of God saying, "Go and find Peter." Now, Peter, at the same time, he was hungry. He was down at the tanner's place, which is really an interesting. Here's an interesting rabbit trail. Why was he at a tanner's place, a Jew who dealt with the dead? Here's a person who would be really marginalized by the Jewish community. You could play with that one. I wouldn't construct the whole sermon out of that, but you might find one. Peter goes up on the roof to pray, and I suppose he probably had a blood sugar problem because he fell into a trance. He was hungry. Low blood sugar. And he has this vision. In the vision is a sheet let down out of heaven. And in the sheet are a variety of animals, both clean and unclean. And the voice of the Lord is, Peter, rise, kill, and eat. And Peter says, I am kosher. I am just not that kind of guy. You know that, Lord. And the Lord, after 3 times, the Lord's response is, Peter, what I have created, don't you call unclean. So you have this double theater in activity. Cornelius has a heart for God, but he's a Roman. He's a Gentile. He sends his associates to find Peter while Peter is having this vision. And just as they arrive at the door, he hears the voice of the Lord saying, go down and do with them as you're instructed. He goes down, asks the question, he invites them to stay overnight, and they move off to Cornelius' house the next day. Now the difficulty is you've got Peter, who's really a racist. That's what he is. He believes that the only group that God cares about are the Jews. Racism isn't being annoyed by the peculiarities of another race. I'm Swedish. And at Christmas time, my family has what they call lutefisk, which is fish dipped in lye. All the cranberry sauce in the world doesn't help. It's awful stuff. And if you walked into a Swedish home, and I don't allow it in my home anymore, you walked into a Swedish home and you say, what is that awful smell? Those Swedes are at it again. So you have all kinds of interracial conflict, and we bump up against each other because there's some things we don't like and some things we do like. That's not racism. Racism is believing that your race is morally superior. And you and I know how fundamentally offensive that is to the creation. Because we are sticking our finger in the eye of God and saying, at times in your creation you were less than adequate. And that's really where Peter was trapped. And so this sheet let down out of heaven is a lesson in race relationships. He is learning something about creation. But notice what happens to him as he moves his way down to Cornelius. Look what the text says. Verse 27. Or 24. The following day he arrived in Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and called together his relatives and close friends. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet. Peter said, get up, stand up, I'm only a man myself. Talking with them, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people. And notice what he says to them. You are well aware. It's like when Paul Martin says, clearly. Maybe we could find another word for it. You are well aware that it's against our law for a Jew to associate with a Gentile or visit him. Hello? What text are you reading, Peter? Oh, we know the cautions that were expressed about the relationship of the Jews with their people, but that was never expressed that way. They had all kinds of relationships with them. There was some preclusion as to what relationships they couldn't have. But what he had done, he had taken the Scriptures and he used it to affirm his own racial prejudice. Of course, it's not something that we've ever done. But Peter is trapped. Peter is trapped in a narrow bind of religious legalism. And it's only as the vision calls him to his sin, because that's what it was, that he was able to make the transition from religious legalism to redemptive love. Now, religious legalism is binding. It's rooted in fear. Have you noticed what a short step it is from grace to legalism? Someone in your church comes to faith in Christ. And they've lived the kind of life that behaviorally is so antithetical to the gospel. You know, we have some people in our community, boy, they look and smell like a Christian, don't they? They just do the right things. And boy, if they would only come to Christ, there wouldn't be much transformation required in them. But some of them, man, they live like the devil, and it takes a great act of grace. And when they come to Christ and they find they're transformed, they come to the cross. Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to your cross I cling. Grace is the only redeeming agent in their lives, and they are grateful for it, and they're transformed. And as they're transformed, as their behavior changes, they then begin to believe that God loves them because now they're living better than they used to. And then they say to their friends, if you only lived like I did, then God would love you. And all of a sudden we've moved from grace, God loves me in spite of myself, to legalism, He loves me because of myself. And therefore, if you will live like me, then God will love you like me. It's really hard to live in grace. It's so counterintuitive to everything in life. We know that our parents will like us if we do good things. My little grandson, 3 years of age, I got some pictures if you want to see them. I think I referred to him last night. I think I refer to him every night. This little sucker, man, he knows what he will act up. And he will, of course, our children don't raise kids the way they should. But you know the one thing that a grandparent learns, the first rule of being a grandparent, keep your big mouth shut. And so he acts up, and my daughter or son-in-law don't discipline him the way I think they should. And he sees that scowl on Grandpa's face, and he knows how to turn it like that. He knows how to move on the good side of Grandpa so fast. So we learn that in life. We know how to turn people to our advantage. And so it's counterintuitive to believe that God doesn't love me because I behave right. God loves me because He loves me because He's chosen to love me. And that grace is a continuing factor in the equation all through life. I learn to please Him and obey Him because I want to, not because He's going to like me more. And so as we follow this life of grace, people so often, and you and I fall into the trap as well, we then come to believe that God loves us because we are good. And that is legalism, and that is no friend of grace. But religious legalism also keeps me from seeing the richness of His calling. I understand the multi-layer calling of the Lord, so that we are all His laos. We're all His people of God. But there is a place, I call myself a New Testament Levite. I've not read this anywhere. I haven't found a theologian that could help to affirm what I believe. But I sense that God has called me into a role to serve the body of Christ as the Levites were called to serve the people of God in the Old Testament. And I think it's a unique calling. It's not a special calling. It's a unique calling. And we are set apart to serve. But we demean the kingdom and His special use of leadership about that kingdom when we reduce His callings only to a series of tasks. We're called as kingdom partners to be working alongside the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, as agents of God to bring about transformation. And the difficulty with falling into religious legalism, as Peter did, we do not see the richness of his calling. Now, Reginald Bibby, the sociologist from Lethbridge, he calls us conservative Protestants. And that's fair. Conservative, in a poli-sci 101, means what? What does it mean to be a conservative? What do conservatives do? They conserve. That's why to be a progressive conservative is a bit of an oxymoron. And why in the political scientific history of our nation, the word progressive was added to conservatives to create that tension between being trapped in conserving only and being progressive. But as I look at Peter, here's my sense of this. Because we have this conserving instinct, As conservatives, we want to keep what we believe is true of the past, although we may not be accurate about our memory of the past. A friend of mine, Jay Kessler, said the reason that we have good old days is we got poor memories and a few good writers. With all respect to you historians. The danger is that we have remembered the past and believe that that's the way it should always be, as if God is trapped within the status quo. On the other hand, the fact is that we did it back then may not even have been right for that time, and we continue to regurgitate or to reproduce that which in its first place wasn't even of God. As transformational leaders, we must not bow to the conserving instincts of the people of God. If that instinct is rooted in preserving what is familiar and comfortable for that reason alone. Let me say it again. Transformational leadership must not bow to the conserving instincts of the people of God. If that instinct is rooted in preserving that which is familiar and comfortable for that reason alone. God has no grandchildren, as someone preached. Every generation must discover it again for themselves. How many of you are or have been, and if you haven't, you will be, in the devil's playground of church music? I referred to that last night. I want this generation that is part of our school, and by the nature of education today, we've got a few generations. I want them to experience the richness of 2,000 years of church life. Church music didn't start with Fanny Crosby, and didn't start with Michael D. Smith either. So I want people to experience that richness. However, the stultifying demand that it was never done this way before is as anti-spirit and as carnal as any of our methods for spirit annulment. My warning is, beware of the spirit of conserving. Beware of the sin of conserving. We conserve. There are many things we conserve. But as we experience the Spirit in moving generation after generation, and we also must think culture to culture. Blair could tell us some things about a missiological analysis that's required as much for the generations that follow us as it is for Borneo. You've got such different cultural icons and views and perspectives and understandings and ways of responding that if we continue to layer on the generations, even though they live in our backyard, we fail to understand that missional impulse that requires exegesis of cultures. Peter, for him, it was radical. He had to move out of those hundreds and hundreds of years of a locked-in paradigm that God cared for the Jews. Yahweh in Israel were one. And to understand that the Goyes, the Gentiles, those who have so violated everything that they believed as a Jew was cared for by God, was an enormous transition for him. This came to me a few years ago. Barbara Frum was alive. You may remember Barbara Frum. She did the CBC. Wonderful journalist. I'd gotten to know Barbara Frum through a number of encounters, and she asked me one day to do a debate on same-sex issues. It was held in Queen Street at a theater downtown Toronto. And there were about 8 or 9 of us from different disciplines. There was the head of health from San Francisco. There was the head of science at the Sorbonne. There was the head of science at McGill, and a variety of people. And I was asked to ask the religious questions. There was a teacher from Vancouver, Al, who was dying of AIDS. I walked into the room, and there were about 300 in this auditorium. And it was set up on the platform, and the cameras and lights were all there. When Barbara introduced me with the Evangelical Fellowship, they booed me. And so I waited for my opportunity. And so when it was my time to ask a question, I said, I find it interesting as I come in here tonight, what you've done, you've already judged me before I've had a chance to speak. It seems to me that's what you accuse us of doing. And there was a polite applause, and I felt a certain carnal pleasure over that. So the evening went on, and I knew why I was there. I was there to ask the biblical questions. It came time, and we were moving around the table. The debate was going on. They taped for 4 hours, and then they edited it into 3 evenings on the journal. Al and I got in a conversation. And in that moment, there was a sheet let down out of heaven. And here's what happened to me. It was an epiphany. When I looked at Al, I didn't see Al. I saw, almost as if reflected in his eyeglasses, myself. And what I saw was very unlovely. There wasn't much of Jesus that I saw. I think I saw a bit of hatred, rejection, a fair chunk of self-righteousness. And I was stunned. I was unnerved. I didn't know where to go with it. I stumbled through the questions, and I got my way through the 4 hours, and finally it was over. What a relief. But I felt like the Spirit had me by the scruff of the neck. It was altar time. They were taking the lights down, moving the cameras away, and I walked around to where Al was talking to Barbara. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't walk out of that place without doing something. He turned and looked at me, and he had that look in his eye, you know, I'm going to hit him over the head with a Bible or something. I put my arm around him and I prayed for him. I didn't know what else to do. I stepped back, and he had the most surprised look on his face. You should have seen the look on Barbara's face. He said, Brian, I'm a Buddhist. I said, Al, I don't care what you are. You're God's creation, and I'm here to tell you that I love you. People ask me later, did it change your view on the subject? No, not at all. Not at all. But I think as we were entering into this whole debate that eventually became public through Supreme Court and all the rest of the stuff, it was as if the Spirit was saying, Brian, I don't trust you in the public debate. I don't trust you. You need to move out of your smug religious legalism. Understanding that the only paradigm through which I operate as creator is I love everyone. There's consequence to sin, and I don't abrogate that consequence. I allow that to happen by the nature of my creation. But I'm calling you to operate in everything you do and say has got to operate through a paradigm of redemptive love. And I can't tell you how liberating that was. It gave me courage to speak because I knew that there was a transformation. It was a new birth for me. Peter made that enormous leap over the boundary of ethnicity. And all you have to do is walk into Israel and to Gaza today, and you understand what that's all about. Now, some of you, especially those of the black community, you understand that like I don't understand it. For him to move outside of that world released the church. It was that one little act of faith in response to what the God was doing in his life. Now the question I ask is, how many times is God is lowering that sheet in my life and I simply don't clue in? It was a vision that moved him from religious legalism to redemptive love. Notice what redemptive love does. Redemptive love, it overcomes information. His misinformation, rather. He said, you are well aware, or clearly. I love that. I never used that before. That's a great line. It opens us to new information. It opened him to the Cornelius story. Can you imagine how deprived Peter would have been if he hadn't been able to carry around in the arsenal of his messages and his instruction to others this great story of Cornelius. It turns us to speak of Christ. Go through the rest of that text in chapter 10, and you'll find that it's nothing but Christological. And it results in God's empowerment. The household came to faith. Redemptive love is a freeing window through which we can see beyond our present. Oh, I know how stunted I am, how that window just closes up. Redemptive love is His nature, and we learn to live by it. Redemptive love is becoming partner with what He is already doing. That's the wonderful thing about vision, is that it brings us into that channel of activity where the Spirit is already at work. I believe this, that those faith moments where we lead our people, or we simply experience a moving forward and trusting of God into a territory, into a moment, into an idea. Wherever we go, the Spirit has already been there. It's true through you work your way through the text, and wherever the people of God are led, the Spirit has already been there. And so for Peter to move down to Cornelius' house, it's a simulcast, is it not? Cornelius is spoken to, Peter is spoken to. And the two of them merge together in this great synthesis of Gentile evangelization. And the third one, I've got a couple of minutes. Go over to chapter 16. In each of these three, now there's a couple of other occasions where the word vision is spoken. You'll find it later on well, first of all, the earlier part of chapter 9 where Paul has the vision and he is converted. And then later on he talks about that same vision when he is speaking to Festus. But when you follow the word vision through Acts, these are the primary stories that emerge. And they are so transformative. And the third one I find to be one of great opportunity. Now the first one, Ananias, he moves from fear to faith. And that's essential. That's the primary tool in our toolbox, is it not? And we need to learn to exercise it. Leadership without faith, I think, is less than leadership. Leadership that operates through that narrow, scrunchy window of religious legalism is so barnacled by its own weight, it sinks. Redemptive love is free. But something else happens to Paul. Luke leads us into another vision. Let me read Acts 16:6. Paul and his companions traveled to the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. And during the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Now, Paul was deliberately trying to move out of the center of Jewish influence. He was working out of the early mandate. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. Their vision was right. Their focus was in line. Their spirit was inclined in the right direction. But they were knocking their heads against doors that wouldn't open. Whatever they were doing, it just wasn't working. And it's here as leaders we struggle. Something's not working. We say, are we doing the wrong thing? Is it the sin in my life? Is it an Achan problem? Why isn't it working? Is it my incompetence? What's the reason for it not working? And that frustration comes to us all. Because as leaders, we want to get something done. And you show me a person who's called a leader but isn't particularly interested in accomplishment, and I'll show you a very fine Monday morning quarterback. Here, Paul, they were facing continual rebuffs. They saw nothing coming out of their activity. And I'm sure it was driving them to distraction. It was here that something happened. Now, there are a couple of questions to ask. How do I know if the seeming lack of progress in ministry is because I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the Spirit isn't working but I can't see it, or I'm just going about it the wrong way? Now, as we read the story of Paul written by Luke, you'd wonder why this call of Macedonia hadn't come earlier. Why hadn't the Lord, by the Spirit, simply bypassed this annoying knocking on closed doors? Well, I think it's the lessons we learn. The Spirit isn't about to short-circuit our experience to make it easier for us. He doesn't step in from the grueling task of learning. His pedagogy is tough, and it's best. What he teaches is what we need to learn. In that moment, if we could ask Paul tonight, there were things that they learned. But that vision for Paul did not come out in a time when he was doing nothing. There's a wonderful line back in Exodus 10. The people of God have come out of Egypt. They are now facing the sea. The Egyptian soldiers are behind them, and they're complaining, "Why didn't you leave us back in Egypt?" And Moses' line is, "Stop and wait for the Lord." Sounds theological. Sounds appropriate. It sounds like a temperate leader. And the Lord says, "What are you doing, Moses? Move on. Move your butts." See, the notion that we can simply stand and let God speak to us, in this occasion at least, was inappropriate. He was saying, "Moses, the only way that I'm going to show my hand is when you move forward. I can't do anything with the people standing there. They haven't gotten to the Red Sea. I can't do that work until they move on." And so as I look at Paul, I realize that Paul, even though he was knocking against closed doors, he was moving forward. There's something about activity that's essential to the walk of faith. I love Stephen Leacock's line, the Canadian humorist. "I believe in luck, and the harder I work, the luckier I get." Let me paraphrase that. I believe in faith. And the more I exercise faith, the more God trusts me to lead. So in that moment, Paul and his colleagues were struggling. You see, failure has a way of sensitizing us to issues that otherwise we might miss. There is something so valuable in the suffering and the struggle of life. We learn something in that moment that we never will learn in the good times. And this story, you and I can attest to time after time. It is the pedagogical formula of the Spirit. We learn in the tough times. And I find here also, timing matters in ministry. Henry Blackaby has some interesting insights. Don't agree with them all, but he doesn't agree with me either. He was a wonderful person to our Youth for Christ program in Saskatoon. He pastored this little Baptist church, Southern Baptist Church, which just seems like such a bizarre kind of combination in Canada, but so be it. It worked in that place. And he had tremendous impact in the lives of students. And his line was always, "Brian, find out what the Spirit's doing." I'm saying, boy, that sounds like being opportunistic. And his line would be, "That's okay. It's at least being opportunistic with God. Because He has a little more wisdom about what should be going on than you do." So as I go about doing what I do and I find myself frustrated day after day in the work that I do, one of the questions that Paul, I'm sure, was asking is, "Spirit, where are you working?" And in the frustration of that moment, when the vision came that night, come to Macedonia, there was an instinctive response because he realized that's what he had been waiting for all along. Timing matters. But it was more than just an opportunity. It was central to the activity of the Spirit. in making this geopolitical leap from the Mideast across to Europe, from Asia and Asia Minor right over into Europe. Strategically, it was at the very core of the evangelistic leap that happened in the centuries following. To go up to the strategic point of Macedonia, not to Rome, to Macedonia. It became an opportunity, an intellectual center that allowed for the development of the gospel in certain regions of that area that became the launching pad for the gospel through the world. That one moment. You and I have no idea what in one moment we might do to another. It might not be us that lead. It might be someone else that we set free. Paul moved from his plans to God's opportunities. That was his vision transfer. That was the paradigm shift, if you like. As Ananias had moved from fear to faith through vision, as Peter moved from religious legalism to redemptive love, Paul, there was nothing wrong with what Paul was doing as what you could say with Peter and Ananias. But with Paul, it was moving from his plans to God's opportunities. Those of us that like to be organized, we can get stuck in the American management model. Write the plan and work the plan. Right? Write the plan and work the plan. If you work hard enough at the plan that you've developed, you'll succeed. I said a moment ago that as much as there is an equality of calling within the laos of God, the people of God, there is a place for spiritual leadership in the church, in the society, and that's a place of leadership that many of us are called to. And the frustrations that you and I experience as we bang our head against the wall, as we face closed door after closed door, is that we can, I'm so guilty of this. You see, I'm the kind of guy that gets up early and works hard in case the Spirit doesn't show up. And that's the sin of my life. I know it's the sin of my life. I'm just not sure, so I want to have plan B in place. And I have to always, even though out of my tradition, I miss the wave of the Spirit day after day after day. To move from my plans to God's opportunities. It was back in my work with EFC, and because of my activity, I had the opportunity of meeting with senior leadership. Len Gustafson, a good old Swede from southeastern Saskatchewan, Estevan. He was the parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister at the time. And Len got me my first appointment, and that first appointment became a number of appointments. It was one of those days with the Prime Minister. And so when you have 40 minutes alone, you make sure that you got your agenda laid out. And so I worked with our national committee on what I would ask, what I would suggest. We'd carefully worked out our agenda. I arrived early. I was there. They put me in a little side office in the PMO, cup of coffee. And I had my Bible with me, and I was nervous. Of course, I was nervous. I wanted things to go well. I wanted to operate out of my mind rather than a sheaf of notes in front of me. So I took out my Bible, and I was flipping through, and I'd been studying Daniel. I guess I was doing in fact, I remember what it was. I was doing a series of January prayer week services at Woodstock Presbyterian Church. And I was preparing for that. Or I had just preached it. But as I was flipping through, I came to Daniel 11. And you know how you read the same text 50 times, and you read it the 51st time, and something just snaps out at you. And I read, I think it was the American Standard I was using at the time, it said, in the first year of King Darius, I arose to be an encouragement and protection for the king. And I felt the same, and I heard the Lord say, Stiller, drop your agenda and bless the king. And I remember reasoning, saying, no, I can't do that, because I'll go back and the committee will say, what did he say about that, and what did he say about this, and what do you think about that? Plus, how do you tell people that God spoke to you? Was it God or the onions I had last night? That's why you always want to confirm it with with a witness. I didn't have any time. They called me in, sat with the PM. We talked about things we talked about before. Finally, he said, Brian, what's your agenda today? I gulped. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I don't have an agenda today. I'm here to be an encouragement to you. Well, he hadn't heard that word in a long time, I guess. I said, what I'd like to do is take you through a couple of biblical texts and just talk about what we see leadership to be. So I took him to Romans 13 and took him to Colossians 1. Talked about the nature of leadership, the role of government in society and God's creation. And we had prayer together. And you know, you have no idea whether you've crossed that line. You've been inappropriate. You've gone too far. Being a poker face that he was, I had no response at all. I walked out and I just, you know, like when you've preached what you know is an awful sermon, and you know that nobody has listened or heard a thing, you're just sick at heart because you want to do what you do well. You did that last Sunday, did you? Yeah. Of course, the committee said, Brian, what do you say about this? I'd say, hold on, folks. I told them my story. They agreed it was the onions. The next week, I was getting on the plane going somewhere, and as I was going through the executive seats, back to the cattle car where most of us sit, the Minister of Justice was there. We're from the same town in Saskatchewan. He said, Brian, how you doing? Talked a bit. He said, whatever happened with you and the PM last week? I said, what was wrong? Well, he said, there's nothing wrong. I said, how do you know about it? I thought it was a private meeting. It was Wednesday afternoon. He said, this morning, Wednesday when they had their caucus meeting, he said, this morning, he told us about your meeting with him. Told us about your Bible study. I didn't know it was a Bible study, but I guess, you look at the Bible, it's a Bible study. He said, he told us it was the most encouraging meeting he's had in ages with anyone. And he said, and if we, the government, forget and don't consider the role of evangelicals in society as a government, we're the losers. That one moment gave more open doors than all the other things we ever did. Jay Kepp, who was Minister of Health and then Justice, a good friend, he said, Stiller, you have more opportunity to see him than we ministers do. It wasn't me. It's just in that one moment. The Lord said, do this. Now, of course, I asked the question, how many times has he said to do this, and I don't? To go from my plans to his opportunities. Now, I don't know where these fit with you. These are ideas and they're stories. And I have no idea where these ideas find themselves into your life. You will individualize or individuate them into yourself. But let me just say this, that the Spirit has chosen you, you've been gifted, and you've been called. We operate in different places with our different gifts. But as you and I lead others, we are in that need of those visions that move us from where we are to where He wants us to be. He too wants to move us out of our comfort zones into that place of faith where only by our engagement of faith and the vulnerability of walking into the water and possibly drowning will the kingdom be moved forward. Tomorrow night I want to talk about leadership, the nature of Christian leadership. But I wanted, when Lee asked me to come, I'm not an academic. I don't provide lectures a lot. But I do know that out of my experience, I wanted to bring to you what I find to be fundamental to how I work and what God has taught me in some very hard ways. The last 10 years have been the most unhappy years of my life. The hardest 10 years I've ever put in. I can't remember a year that I've really enjoyed where I am. The Lord called me, and I know specifically that He called me, and I know it to today. But I wouldn't have chosen this job for over 1,000 jobs. But I have found that God has taught me. I gained the pedagogical principle. You learn more in the tough times than the good times. He has taught me things because I believe that He has a plan for me for eternity, and He's prepping me for eternity as He's prepping you as well. The moment you are in, the place you are in, may not be a happy moment. But as people would say to me, are you enjoying what you're doing? I would say, wrong question. Wrong question. Are you doing what God's calling you to do? Right question. And I've come to believe this, and I've held on to this, folks, is that I believe that out of obedience there will be joy. But even if there isn't much of that, big deal. Because God's kingdom is bigger than my own feelings, my own sense of comfort, the feedback that reinforces what I think I should, what I would like to be. I don't say that to garner any kind of sympathy from you, because I know I won't get it. Because we realize that our call is to move forward. And this vision that is always moving us from where we are to where He wants us to be is the work of the Spirit, and He will keep doing that in our lives until He returns, or until we go, whatever happens first. So be encouraged, even if you don't enjoy it. He may want to move you on from where you are, but understand that before He moves you on, there's things that He still wants you to learn. And it's better that we open our hearts to learn than to fight the Spirit. Find the wave and ride it. See the vision and obey it.